Picture this scene, somewhere in Africa, tens of thousands of years ago. A young woman steps away from the camp, just a short distance. With her, two, maybe three older women. No doctor, no hospital, no instrument that we would today recognize as medical. No pain relief of any kind. What lies ahead of her is something that, at this very moment, is considered one of the most dangerous events in a human life, anywhere on the planet. She is about to give birth. And here's the strange thing we need to start with. We tend to assume that because childbirth is natural, it must be straightforward. A cat gives birth under the sofa and by morning is grooming her kittens. A horse foals in a field and within an hour the foal is standing. So why did human birth become something that required helpers, rituals, and eventually entire hospitals? The answer is remarkable. Human childbirth is not just nature doing its thing. From an evolutionary standpoint, it is one of the most difficult and dangerous acts of reproduction among all mammals on Earth. And the way our ancestors managed it, without a single doctor, is really a story about what made us human in the first place. Today we're going to look at how it actually worked, why human birth is so hard, who helped and what they did, what the price was, and why some things we assume are the natural way to give birth are actually quite recent inventions. Fair warning, I'll also be honest about where scientists genuinely disagree. Stay with me. By the end, you'll see the arrival of a human being into the world in a completely different way. Let's start with the basic question. Why is human birth so difficult? Millions of species manage it without much drama. To understand this, you have to go back very far, to the moment our ancestors stood up on two legs. Bipedalism is a wonderful thing. It freed the hands, made it possible to carry food, tools, children. It let us see farther across the savannah. But it came with a hidden cost, and it was women who paid it. When the skeleton restructured itself for walking upright, the pelvis changed. To bear the weight of an upright body, to make each stride efficient, the pelvis had to become narrow and compact, and the birth canal runs directly through that narrow space. That alone would have been manageable. Other apes, with their pelvises, give birth fairly easily. But then a second revolution happened. Around 2 million years ago, our ancestors' brains began expanding rapidly, and a bigger brain means a bigger head. And there you have a conflict that anthropologist Sherwood Washburn named in 1960, the obstetric dilemma. The logic is brutal. Walking efficiently requires a narrow pelvis. Delivering a large-brained baby requires a wide one. These two demands pull in opposite directions. And the female body got caught exactly in the middle. How tight is the fit? Here are the numbers, and they are striking. In a modern woman, the birth canal at its widest is about 13 centimeters, at its narrowest around 10. A newborn's head, about 10 centimeters. The shoulders, around 12. Think about that. A 10-centimeter head passing through a 10-centimeter opening. The margin is essentially zero. In most other primates, there's comfortable room to spare. In humans, there is no room to spare at all. But the tight passage is only half the problem. The other half is what the baby has to do to get through it. In other apes, the infant travels through the birth canal in a relatively straight path and emerges facing forward, toward the mother. This is enormously convenient. The mother can reach down, guide the baby, unwrap the cord from its neck if needed, clear its nose and mouth so it can breathe. An ape mother can essentially deliver herself. With humans, it's different, and this matters enormously. Our birth canal is shaped in such a way that the baby's head enters facing one direction, and then, partway through, must rotate. The baby essentially corkscrews. And it exits facing backward, away from the mother. That might sound like a small detail. The consequences are enormous. A woman giving birth alone cannot safely assist a baby emerging face down. If she tries to pull the baby toward herself, she's pulling against the natural curve of its neck and spine, risking serious injury. She can't see the baby's face, can't easily clear the airway, can't check for the cord. And this brings us to the central idea of this whole story. Because of the tight fit, because of the rotation, because of the baby emerging face backward, humans appear to be the only species for whom having someone else present during birth is not just helpful, but very nearly required. Not convenient, almost necessary. Researchers Karen Rosenberg and Wenda Trevathan, who have studied this for decades, called it obligate midwifery. The idea that assisted birth isn't optional for our species, it's essentially built into our biology. Active assistance during birth is vanishingly rare in other primates. In humans, it appears in every culture, on every continent, throughout all of recorded history. Think about what that means. Assisted childbirth is not an invention of modern medicine. It is not a luxury of the last few centuries. It may be one of the oldest forms of human cooperation that exists. The midwife may be older than agriculture, older than the wheel, older than writing. One of the first things human beings ever started doing for each other was helping each other arrive. And how deep does this go? There's a genuinely extraordinary detail here. Scientists have studied the pelvis of Neanderthals, our closest extinct relatives, who diverged from our lineage hundreds of thousands of years ago. It appears that in Neanderthal birth, the infant would also have had to rotate through the canal and would have emerged face backward, which strongly suggests that Neanderthal women also needed assistance during birth. If both modern humans and Neanderthals arrived at the same anatomical situation, then obligate midwifery may stretch back to our common ancestor, hundreds of thousands of years into the past. We may have been helping each other be born before we were even fully modern humans. Now let's talk about who these helpers actually were and what they did. Almost certainly, other women. Women who had already given birth themselves. Women who had witnessed births before and knew what to expect. Experienced mothers, grandmothers, sisters. Not with degrees, with knowledge accumulated through their own bodies and the dozens of births they had attended. The knowledge passed not through books, but hand to hand, woman to woman, generation to generation. What did they know how to do? More than you might expect. They knew how to receive a baby emerging face down, how to support it correctly without pulling against the neck. They could unwrap the cord if it was around the baby's neck. They could clear the newborn's nose and mouth for the first breath. They could assist with the placenta. They could physically support the mother, hold her, give her something to brace against. And they could provide something that is genuinely medically relevant even today, the presence of a calm, experienced person. I'm here. I know what to do. You are not alone. The psychological dimension of this is not a soft add-on. Fear and tension during labor are physiologically disruptive. They make contractions less effective, increase pain perception, slow progress. A calm, trusted attendant is not a luxury. It is a functional part of how birth works. Now, in what position did prehistoric women give birth? This is where we get one of the more striking reversals of conventional wisdom. We have a very specific image in our heads. Woman lying on her back, legs raised, medical staff surrounding her. That image, it turns out, almost certainly does not describe how humanity gave birth for most of its history. Back in 1882, a researcher named Engelman studied birth practices across traditional cultures around the world and noted something striking. Women left to their own instincts almost universally avoided giving birth on their backs. They wanted to be upright. The data backs this up firmly. In a survey of 76 traditional cultures, only 14 gave birth lying on their backs. All the others, vertical, squatting. Kneeling. Standing, gripping a pole, a rope, a branch, or the shoulders of a helper. Sitting on a birthing stool, or simply cradled in another woman's arms. Women used whatever was available: a stake driven into the ground, a rope suspended from a beam, a knotted cloth, a pile of stones, a mound of sand shaped to support the body. All of these are devices to keep the body upright and give something to brace against during contractions. This is not arbitrary. There's solid physics behind it. When a woman squats, the very geometry of her pelvic bone shifts. The outlet widens. Gravity works in the right direction. The weight of her own body isn't pressing against the sacrum. Modern research confirms that upright positions, on average, shorten labor and reduce pain. Though, to be fair, they also carry a slightly higher risk of perineal tearing. No position is perfect, but our ancestors' choice of vertical wasn't superstition or tradition for its own sake. It was biomechanically sound. So where did the on-your-back position come from? The answer is sobering. It spread through Europe relatively late, roughly between the 14th and 17th centuries, as birth transitioned from women's hands into the hands of male physicians. The woman lying on her back is convenient not for the woman, it's convenient for the person managing the birth who wants to see and control what's happening. The position we consider normal is, in historical terms, a fairly recent invention, designed largely for the doctor's benefit, not the mother's. A woman giving birth 50,000 years ago would likely have found it baffling. What about pain relief? What did they do when things went wrong? Let's be honest here. There was no magic solution. But across the world, traditional birth attendants used plants, herbal preparations, compresses. Warm compresses applied to the perineum for relief, something modern midwives still write about. Herbal teas believed to speed labor or reduce pain. Abdominal massage to help reposition a baby lying in the wrong orientation. Some of these worked. Warmth, movement, massage, supported positions, these have measurable effects. Some were ritual, providing psychological calm rather than direct physical relief. But psychological calm, as we've discussed, matters medically, and the accumulated knowledge of an experienced birth attendant was itself a form of treatment. A skilled practitioner could recognize by feel that a baby was presenting feet first, could attempt to reposition it externally through the abdomen, knew which plants helped slow bleeding, knew what to do with the cord, with the placenta. This was real, accumulated, practical medicine, just without written records or white coats. But, and this must be said plainly, this medicine had hard limits. Now we come to the most difficult part of the story. I promised honesty, so let's not romanticize this. Birth without hospitals and without modern medicine was lethal. For mothers and for infants both. Here are the numbers, with an important caveat about where they come from. We have no direct data from the Paleolithic. Bones rarely preserve the information we need. So researchers look at hunter-gatherer societies that survived into modern times as the nearest available window into the past. It's an imperfect window, but it's the best one we have. What it shows is hard to look at. Infant mortality was staggering by our standards. Across roughly 20 studied hunter-gatherer societies, around 27% of children, more than 1 in 4, did not survive to their first birthday. Nearly half, around 47 to 49%, did not survive to reproductive age. Half. Every child born around a campfire had roughly equal odds of growing up or dying young. Maternal mortality. Estimates for the Aceh people of Paraguay put it at around 670 maternal deaths per 100,000 births. For the Hadza of Tanzania, around 1,022 per 100,000. To put that in perspective, in modern high-income countries, that number is somewhere between 2 and 10 per 100,000. Childbirth was hundreds of times more dangerous. Important caveat, these figures come from groups already in contact with the outside world, so how precisely they reflect deep prehistory is uncertain, but the order of magnitude speaks for itself. First births were the most dangerous of all. A young woman's first labor was where the worst outcomes concentrated. And this left a trace we can still measure. There is a quietly devastating piece of evidence from the ground itself. Archaeologists studying ancient burial sites of hunter-gatherers sometimes notice a strange pattern. Among the skeletons of young adults, there are noticeably more women than men of the same age. In one study of Stone Age burials in southern Africa, there were 26 young women among the dead and only 14 young men of the same age group. Why were young women dying at higher rates than young men? The most likely explanation is first births. Death in childbirth left its mark in bones that have survived for thousands of years. That is the real price. Behind each of us living today stands an unbroken chain of women, every one of whom survived long enough to pass on the next link. Not a single break in hundreds of thousands of years. Now, as promised, the part where scientists disagree. Because the clean story of the obstetric dilemma has, in recent years, received serious challenges, you deserve to hear both sides. The classic version goes, childbirth is difficult because the narrow pelvis needed for walking is in conflict with the large head of the baby, and evolution's compromise was to deliver babies early, relatively underdeveloped, so that the head would be small enough to fit. That's why human newborns are so helpless compared to other animals. It's an elegant theory, but here's what critics say, particularly researcher Holly Dunsworth. First, when you actually do the math, human pregnancy is not unusually short for a primate of our body size. It's roughly what you'd expect. Second, a human newborn's brain is not abnormally small. It's normal, or even larger than expected for a primate of our size. So the idea that we deliver prematurely because of pelvic constraints turns out, on close inspection, to be shakier than it first appears. There's another interesting thread. Some researchers argue that the worst difficulties of human birth became pronounced relatively late, not millions of years ago, but with the transition to settled agriculture. Why? Nutrition changed and often worsened, altering body proportions. People stopped squatting habitually in daily life, and habitual deep squatting actually influences the shape of the pelvis over a lifetime. Increased carbohydrate consumption meant babies were born larger. If this is right, some of what made birth so brutal is partly a side effect of civilization itself, not purely a deep evolutionary inevitability. And one more detail that complicates the idea of human uniqueness. For a long time, it was claimed that assisted birth existed only in our species. But primatologists have now documented female bonobos surrounding and supporting a laboring female, a rudimentary form of the same cooperation. So even our uniquely human midwifery may have roots deeper than we thought. What to make of all this? Here's an honest conclusion. The truth is almost certainly in the middle, and messier than any clean slogan. Human birth is genuinely more difficult and more dangerous than birth in most other primates. Almost everyone agrees on that. But the simple old formula of narrow pelvis versus big head is only part of the picture, not the whole story. Reality, as always, is richer than any elegant diagram. One more thing worth saying, to avoid the opposite error. From everything we've covered, it's easy to assume that all prehistoric women always gave birth surrounded by helpers. But even that isn't quite true. There was at least one well-documented group that did the opposite. The Kung San of the Kalahari considered it ideal for a woman to give birth alone, walking away from camp by herself. Doing it alone was a matter of pride and a demonstration of strength. In practice, it didn't always work out that way. Women often ended up giving birth near others anyway. But the simple fact matters. There was no single prehistoric way of giving birth. There were dozens of different traditions, customs, beliefs about what was right and what was proper. Human culture, even in this, the most bodily and fundamental of events, turned out to be astonishingly varied. So how did prehistoric women give birth without doctors and without hospitals? Now we can answer properly. They gave birth by passing through what may be the most physically demanding act of reproduction that evolution imposed on any large animal, through a body caught between the demands of walking upright and delivering a large-brained child. They gave birth not lying down, but upright, squatting, kneeling, gripping a pole or a rope, or another woman's hands, using the physics of their own body and gravity as their allies. They gave birth not alone, but alongside other women who knew what they were doing, and that female knowledge, passed hand to hand across generations, was real medicine long before medicine was a word. They gave birth with herbs, warm compresses, massage, and the sound of a calm voice nearby in place of anesthesia. And they gave birth paying a terrible price, a price we can read even in their bones. Here is what's worth carrying away. The body of a woman giving birth 70,000 years ago was built exactly like the body of a woman giving birth today. The same pelvis, the same rotation of the child, the same fear, and the same strength. And what we call civilization, medicine, care, the idea that you don't leave someone alone at their worst moment, may have its roots right here, in some very distant ancestor reaching out their hands to receive someone else's child. We often think of medicine and mutual care as late, refined products of civilization, but it looks like it's the other way around. One of the first things human beings ever did for one another was help each other be born. That's a remarkable beginning.